Part 1. The tension in the United Nations General Assembly Hall was palpable as President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso prepared to address the world's most important diplomatic forum. It was September 2024, and rumors had been circulating for weeks that the young African leader was planning something unprecedented for his UN debut. Seated in the audience, representatives from major Western powers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They had been briefed by their intelligence services about Traoré's recent policies in Burkina Faso, the nationalization of gold mines, the expulsion of French military forces, the introduction of free healthcare and education funded entirely by reclaimed mineral revenues. What they hadn't anticipated was how boldly he would challenge the entire international system on the world's biggest stage. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres introduced Traoré with the standard diplomatic courtesy, but even he seemed aware that this speech would be different from the typical UN addresses filled with platitudes about international cooperation and mutual respect. Distinguished delegates, fellow leaders, citizens of the world, Traoré began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of determination. I stand before you today representing not just the people of Burkina Faso, but speaking for a continent that has been silent for too long. The opening was already more direct than most UN speeches, and the hall immediately fell silent as delegates sensed they were about to hear something significant. For decades, African leaders have come to this podium to beg for aid, to plead for debt relief, to request assistance for problems that were largely created by the very nations we were asking to help us solve them. Today, I am here to announce that this era of begging is over. Several African delegates began to sit up straighter, while Western representatives looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of Traoré's remarks. Let me be very clear about what I mean, Traoré continued, stepping away from the podium slightly to address the hall more directly. When I say the era of begging is over, I mean that Africa will no longer accept the premise that our poverty is natural, that our underdevelopment is inevitable, or that our dependence on Western assistance is permanent. The young president's tone remained measured, but his words were beginning to land like carefully aimed missiles at the foundations of international development orthodoxy. I want to share some statistics with this assembly that I believe you have a right to know. Last year, Western corporations extracted approximately $750 billion worth of resources from African soil. African governments received less than $50 billion in combined taxes, royalties, and wages from these operations. Where did the other $700 billion go? He paused, allowing the magnitude of these numbers to register throughout the hall. Several delegates were frantically taking notes, clearly understanding they were hearing a level of specificity rarely presented at the UN. It went to shareholders in London, Paris, New York, and Frankfurt. It went to executives who have never lived in the communities affected by their extraction operations. It went to investment funds that view African poverty as an acceptable cost of doing business. The systematic presentation of data was making Traoré's argument impossible to dismiss as mere rhetoric. This was a carefully documented case for fundamental change. But the extraction of resources is only part of the story, Traoré continued. African nations currently pay over $180 billion annually in debt service to Western creditors. Much of this debt was incurred by previous governments under agreements that primarily benefited foreign contractors and consultants rather than African development. The debt crisis statistics were well known to most delegates, but Traoré was presenting them in a new context that highlighted their fundamental injustice. So let me summarize the mathematics of what some call international cooperation. Western corporations extract $750 billion worth of African resources annually while African governments receive $50 billion. African nations then pay $180 billion in debt service to Western creditors. The net result is that $880 billion flows out of Africa every year while $50 billion stays on the continent. The precision of these calculations was devastating, reducing complex economic relationships to simple arithmetic that exposed their exploitative nature. This is not cooperation. This is not partnership. This is not development assistance. This is systematic wealth extraction disguised as international relations. By now, the Western delegates were looking visibly uncomfortable, while African representatives were nodding in recognition of truths they had long understood but rarely heard articulated so directly on the international stage. But I am not here today simply to complain about the past, Traoré said, his tone shifting slightly toward a more forward-looking perspective. I am here to announce what Africa intends to do about this situation. The hall grew even quieter, if that was possible, as delegates understood they were about to hear concrete policy announcements rather than just diplomatic criticism. Over the past 6 months, my government has been working quietly with leaders across Africa to develop what we are calling the African Resource Sovereignty Initiative. This initiative has 3 fundamental components. Traoré began counting on his fingers as he outlined each element. First, the renegotiation of all resource extraction agreements to ensure that at least 60% of revenues remain on the African continent. Companies that refuse to renegotiate will be nationalized. Several mining company executives in the observer gallery looked alarmed, clearly realizing that their business models were under direct attack. Second, the establishment of an African monetary fund that will provide development financing to African nations without the structural adjustment conditions imposed by Western institutions. This fund will be capitalized entirely by African resources and managed by African financial experts. The implications of an alternative to the World Bank and IMF were enormous, and delegates from those institutions were clearly scrambling to understand the full scope of what Traoré was proposing. Third, the creation of an African military security pact that will eliminate the need for foreign military bases on African soil. African security will be provided by African forces accountable to African governments and African citizens. The military implications were as significant as the economic ones, potentially ending decades of French, American, and other foreign military presence across the continent. These are not proposals. These are not suggestions. These are decisions that have already been made by sovereign African governments tired of accepting poverty as the price of international cooperation. The definitiveness of Traoré's language was striking. This wasn't a negotiation or a request for dialogue, this was a declaration of fundamental policy changes that were already being implemented. I know that some of you will call this dangerous. Some will call it reckless. Some will call it a threat to international stability, Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength. But I would ask you to consider dangerous for whom? Reckless for whom? A threat to whose stability? The rhetorical questions hung in the air, unanswered but clearly directed at the Western powers who had benefited most from existing arrangements. Is it dangerous for African children to have access to healthcare funded by African gold rather than European profits? Is it reckless for African universities to be built with African diamond revenues rather than World Bank loans that our grandchildren will still be paying off? Each question was designed to highlight the moral contradictions inherent in the international system's response to African independence. Is it a threat to stability when African farmers can afford the fertilizer produced from their own phosphate deposits? When African manufacturers can access the raw materials extracted from their own soil? When African governments can fund infrastructure projects without borrowing money from the same banks that finance the companies extracting their resources? The logic was becoming inescapable, presented with a combination of moral clarity and economic precision that was difficult to refute. The only stability threatened by African economic independence is the stability of systems designed to keep Africa impoverished while enriching everyone else. As Traoré prepared to conclude the first part of his address, the hall remained in complete silence, with delegates clearly understanding they had just witnessed the most direct challenge to the post-colonial economic order ever delivered at the United Nations. But the young president wasn't finished. He had saved his most pointed criticisms for the conclusion of this opening section, understanding that his words would reverberate far beyond the assembly hall. I know there are those in this assembly who will dismiss what I have said as the naive idealism of a young African leader who doesn't understand the complexities of international relations, Traoré continued, his tone becoming more personal and direct. To those critics, who would say this, I have buried children killed by terrorists while their government was more concerned with maintaining military contracts with foreign powers than protecting its own citizens. I have slept in villages without electricity while foreign companies extracted uranium from deposits just kilometers away. I have listened to mothers explain why they would rather risk death crossing the Mediterranean than remain in homelands rich enough to feed half the world but kept poor enough to provide cheap labor. The personal testimony was powerful, grounding Traoré's economic arguments in human experiences that no amount of diplomatic sophistication could dismiss. This is not naive idealism. This is hard-earned realism about systems that have failed African people for generations while enriching everyone else. He looked directly at the section where Western delegates were seated, his gaze moving slowly from the American delegation to the French, from the British to the Germans. Some of you will threaten sanctions. Some will withdraw aid. Some will attempt to isolate African nations that choose sovereignty over subordination. But understand this. We are no longer afraid of your threats because we have finally understood that your aid has been keeping us poor, your loans have been keeping us dependent, and your protection has been keeping us vulnerable. The systematic dismantling of Western policy assumptions was now complete, but Traoré had one more surprise for his audience. Before I conclude this portion of my remarks, I want to share something with this assembly that will help you understand why the changes I have announced are not just the policy of Burkina Faso, but represent a continental awakening that can no longer be contained. He pulled out a document from his jacket pocket, a gesture that immediately focused every camera and every delegate's attention. In my hand, I hold signed commitments from the leaders of 17 African nations to implement the African Resource Sovereignty Initiative within the next 12 months. These nations represent over 400 million people and control approximately 60% of Africa's mineral wealth. The revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembly hall. This wasn't just one small country making bold statements, this was a coordinated continental movement with the economic power to fundamentally disrupt global supply chains. Nigeria has committed to nationalizing its oil industry and redirecting petroleum revenues to African development priorities. The Democratic Republic of Congo will reclaim control of its cobalt and lithium deposits from multinational corporations. Ghana will restructure its gold mining sector to ensure that 70% of revenues remain in the country. Each announcement represented billions of dollars in potential economic disruption for Western corporations and investors. South Africa will renegotiate all mining contracts to prioritize domestic beneficiation over raw material exports. Kenya will take control of its ports from foreign management companies. Tanzania will establish state control over its agricultural exports to ensure fair prices for farmers. The list continued, each commitment more significant than the last, painting a picture of coordinated African action that would reshape global commodity markets. These are not empty promises or diplomatic gestures. Part 2. The immediate aftermath of Traoré's speech was unlike anything the United Nations had ever witnessed. As the Burkinabe president stepped away from the podium, the assembly hall erupted into chaos. African delegates were on their feet delivering thunderous applause, while Western representatives sat in stunned silence, frantically texting their capitals about the diplomatic earthquake they had just experienced. But Traoré wasn't finished. As the applause began to die down, he returned to the microphone, raising his hand for silence. The hall quieted immediately, understanding that more was coming. Before I conclude my remarks, Traoré said, his voice now carrying an edge of steel, I believe this assembly deserves to hear directly from some of the world leaders who have spent years lecturing Africa about governance, democracy, and economic responsibility. He gestured toward the section where Western delegates were seated. I see that President Macron of France is in attendance today. Perhaps he would like to explain to this assembly why French companies extracted $47 billion worth of uranium from Niger last year while Niger remains one of the poorest countries in the world. The French president shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting to be called out so directly in an international forum. Diplomatic protocol didn't typically include such confrontational exchanges. Or perhaps Chancellor Scholz of Germany would like to discuss why German automotive companies pay Congolese miners $2 per day to extract cobalt worth $50,000 per ton on international markets? The German delegation looked equally uncomfortable as murmurs began rippling through the assembly hall. Maybe Prime Minister Sunak of the United Kingdom could enlighten us about why British banks charge African nations 12% interest on development loans while lending to European governments at 2%? Each question was delivered with surgical precision, backed by statistics that the targeted leaders couldn't easily dispute. But then something unprecedented happened. President Macron stood up. Mr. President, Macron interrupted, his voice carrying across the hall through a portable microphone. With respect, you are oversimplifying complex economic relationships that have benefited both France and our African partners for generations. The hall went completely silent. This kind of direct exchange between heads of state during a UN address was virtually unheard of. Traoré smiled slightly, clearly having anticipated this moment. President Macron, thank you for volunteering to participate in this discussion. Perhaps you could explain to this assembly how extracting $47 billion while leaving Niger in poverty benefits our African partners? Macron's face flushed slightly. France has provided security, investment, and institutional support to West Africa for decades. Our military presence prevented Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso from falling to terrorist groups. Prevented? Traoré asked, his eyebrows rising. President Macron, terrorist attacks in the Sahel increased by 300% during the period of French military intervention. Your forces were protecting mining operations, not African civilians. The exchange was electric, with delegates and journalists understanding they were witnessing a historic confrontation between two very different visions of international relations. Furthermore, Traoré continued, since Burkina Faso expelled French forces and took control of our own security, terrorist incidents in our territory have decreased by 60%. It turns out African soldiers are quite effective at protecting African people when they're not constrained by foreign command structures designed to protect foreign economic interests. The precision of Traoré's statistics was devastating, reducing complex security arguments to simple performance metrics that favored the African approach. Chancellor Scholz apparently decided to join the fray. President Traoré, you cannot simply ignore international law and existing commercial agreements. German companies have invested billions in African operations under legally binding contracts. Traoré turned his attention to the German leader. Chancellor Scholz, those legally binding contracts were signed by African leaders who received substantial personal compensation from the same companies that benefited from the agreements. When governments are bought by foreign corporations, their contracts lose democratic legitimacy. But more importantly, Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength, I want to ask you something specific. Do you believe that Congolese children deserve the same opportunities as German children? The question was simple but profound, cutting through diplomatic complexity to moral fundamentals. Scholz hesitated. Of course, all children deserve opportunities. Then why does Germany allow its companies to pay Congolese miners wages that guarantee their children will remain in poverty? Traoré interrupted. Why does German law require minimum wages for German workers but not for African workers who extract the materials that power German industries? The moral trap was perfect, highlighting contradictions that no amount of diplomatic sophistication could explain away. By now, other Western leaders were clearly hoping to avoid being drawn into the confrontation, but Traoré wasn't finished. President Biden, he called out, addressing the American leader directly. The United States frequently lectures the world about human rights and democratic values. Could you explain why American corporations extracted $89 billion worth of resources from Africa last year while African Americans in your own country experience poverty rates that would be considered a humanitarian crisis if they occurred in Africa? The question was brilliant, connecting domestic American inequality to international exploitation in a way that highlighted systemic contradictions in U.S. policy. Biden, clearly caught off guard, stood slowly. President Traoré, America has been a champion of African development through our aid programs, our trade initiatives. Mr. President, Traoré cut him off politely but firmly. American aid to Africa totaled $8 billion last year. American corporations extracted $89 billion worth of African resources. So for every dollar America gives Africa in aid, American companies take $11 in resources. Is that what you call development assistance? The mathematical precision of the argument was unanswerable, reducing American foreign policy to a simple accounting equation that revealed its fundamental nature. The confrontation had now escalated beyond anything anyone in the assembly had ever witnessed. Three major world leaders were being systematically dismantled by a 34-year-old African president who had come to power through a military coup. But I want to be clear about something, Traoré said, his tone becoming more reflective. I am not attacking any of you personally. I am attacking systems that have failed African people while enriching everyone else. Systems that all of you inherited and that all of you have perpetuated, but that none of you necessarily designed. The slight shift toward a more conciliatory tone made his next words even more powerful. The question before this assembly today is simple: are we willing to acknowledge that these systems have failed? Are we prepared to work together to build something better? Or will we continue to defend arrangements that create prosperity for some through the impoverishment of others? He looked around the hall, making eye contact with delegates from every region. Africa is offering the world a partnership based on equality rather than exploitation. We are proposing trade relationships that benefit all parties rather than enriching some at the expense of others. We are suggesting security cooperation that protects people rather than corporate interests. But we are also making clear that with or without international cooperation, Africa will control African resources, African governments will serve African people, and African leaders will prioritize African development. Traoré returned to the podium for his final words. The choice before the international community is simple. Engage with Africa as equals, or watch as Africa builds its own institutions, develops its own markets, and pursues its own interests without seeking permission from anyone. The era of African subordination is over. The era of African independence has begun. As thunderous applause erupted from the African delegations, Traoré walked away from the podium, having delivered the most devastating critique of Western policy ever heard at the United Nations. The young president from Burkina Faso had just redefined the terms of international relations, and the world would never be the same. But the immediate aftermath was even more dramatic than the speech itself. As Traoré left the assembly hall, Western delegates were frantically calling their capitals, trying to explain how a diplomatic routine had turned into a global crisis. President Macron's face was ashen as his advisors surrounded him, clearly understanding that the confrontation had been a public relations disaster for France. The precise statistics Traoré had cited about Niger's uranium were already being fact-checked by journalists, and early reports confirmed their accuracy. Chancellor Scholz was similarly shaken, particularly by the moral questions about Congolese children that he had been unable to answer effectively. The German delegation was huddled in urgent conversation, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't further damage their position. President Biden appeared confused and frustrated, clearly unprepared for the kind of direct confrontation that Traoré had initiated. American diplomatic protocol didn't typically prepare leaders for such aggressive statistical challenges to their foreign policy assumptions. Meanwhile, the African delegations were celebrating. The Nigerian president approached Traoré as he left the podium, embracing him warmly and whispering, "You said what we've all been thinking for decades." Similar scenes played out across the assembly hall as African leaders congratulated their young colleague for his courage. The media reaction was immediate and explosive. Within minutes of the speech's conclusion, news networks around the world were breaking into regular programming to cover what commentators were already calling the most significant diplomatic confrontation since the end of the Cold War. CNN's headline read, "Burkina Faso President Demolishes Western Leaders at UN, Direct Confrontation Stuns Assembly." The BBC reported, "Traoré versus the West, young African leader challenges global order in historic UN speech. Al Jazeera's coverage focused on the African reaction, continental awakening. African leaders rally behind Burkina Faso's challenge to Western powers. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from social media, where clips of the confrontation were spreading faster than any UN speech in history. The hashtag Traoré versus the West was trending globally within an hour, with millions of users sharing their favorite moments from the exchange. Young Africans in particular were celebrating Traoré's performance with commentary that revealed years of frustration with Western paternalism. Finally, someone said it to their faces, posted a university student in Lagos. "This is what happens when Africa stops being polite," wrote a young entrepreneur in Nairobi. The financial market's reaction was swift and severe. European stock exchanges were in freefall as investors realized that the coordinated African action Traoré had announced could disrupt global commodity supply chains. Mining companies saw their share prices drop by 30 to 40%. Currency traders were panic selling as the implications of African monetary independence began to sink in. In London, the FTSE 100 had dropped 600 points by the time markets closed. In Paris, the CAC 40 suffered its worst single-day loss in months. Even Wall Street wasn't immune, with American corporations that had extensive African operations experiencing massive sell-offs. But the most significant reaction came from African capitals, where governments that hadn't been part of Traoré's initial coalition were announcing their intention to review their relationships with Western corporations and international financial institutions. By evening, the presidents of Kenya, Ghana, and Zambia had issued statements expressing solidarity with Traoré's message. The South African president announced the formation of a commission to investigate mining contracts with foreign corporations. The Ethiopian prime minister declared his government's intention to pursue economic policies that prioritize Ethiopian interests. The domino effect that Traoré had initiated was spreading across the continent faster than anyone had anticipated. As night fell in New York, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the city that housed the United Nations. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from world leaders, journalists, and activists, all trying to understand the implications of what had just happened. The young president from Burkina Faso had walked into the world's most important diplomatic forum and systematically dismantled the assumptions underlying the global economic order. In doing so, he had not only defended Africa's right to control its own resources but had also exposed the moral contradictions that Western leaders had spent decades trying to ignore. The era of polite African diplomacy was officially over. The era of direct, unapologetic advocacy for African interests had begun.